Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to Psychiatry Grand Rounds. Our guest today is the Watkins University professor from Stanford Anthropology Department. Her work explores the varieties of human experience and all the ways people make sense of the world, from magic and the supernatural to spirituality and religion and psychosis and subjectivity. She's worked in Chicago with homeless and psychotic women, with people who hear voices in Chennai, Accra, and San Mateo, with evangelical Christians who hear the voice of God, and with psychiatric residents training all over the US. The many awards and honors she's received include election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Beyer Award for the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. Her books have been recognized with the Victor Turner Prize for Ethnographic Writing, the Boyer Prize for Psychological Anthropology, and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. She's not only well published in the social science literature, but also her works appeared in the American Journal of Psychiatry, Schizophrenia Bulletin, Psychosis, and the British Journal of Psychiatry. And in addition to these prolific academic publications, she's also had her work featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and today she is featured on the NPR show, The Hidden Brain. That was very nice of them to sort of roll it out in conjunction with our Grand Rounds. I particularly highly recommend two of her books to this audience. A recent book that she co-authored and edited, Our Most Troubling Madness, is a collection of case studies from psychosis from around the world. And her earlier book, Of Two Minds, is a book she wrote from a study of psychiatric training programs in the US. Today's talk is entitled, Is the Shaman Schizophrenic After All? Voice, Hearing, and Culture. So please join me in welcoming Professor Tanya Luhrmann.
So thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'll do today is talk a little bit about my experience as an anthropologist and what this and hearing voices, and sort of invite us to have a richer conversation about psychosis and the psychotic process through this story. I'm going to begin with a graduation ceremony. This is about 45, 50 seconds. And keep your eye on the woman in white. Okay. So that took place in Cape Coast in Ghana. It's about 3 hours west of the Cape Coast is about 3 hours west of Accra. She has graduated to become an okomfos. She's demonstrating her authority and power by dancing in the fire. She'll do that. She did that 9 times over the course of the evening. As you drive around Cape Coast, you see signs like this of okomfos or absorption, people who are working with different gods, who are advertising their services. These are people who are often the first defense for medical care in local communities. They also offer protection against the malevolent forces that are thought to be prevalent in the area. Some of them are very wealthy. They have grand compounds. Some of them are not so well off. They live in a world of many gods. This is a structure a lot like Santeria, Vundun, Bahia, Candomblé, where you've got a kind of a pyramid, and up at the top is one great grand god, the Christian god or the Islamic god. And then there are other gods and sort of decreasing degrees of importance, maybe named gods, maybe not named gods, maybe spirits of trees, spirits of the river, maybe relatives. And the shrine is the medium through which sort of officially there's an interaction with these gods. So people will, the okomfos will leave rum or schnapps or a cup of coffee or things that the different gods may like. And often an okomfos interacts with many gods, maybe 2 or 5 or 20 or more. Once a year, they feed these gods with a sacrifice of blood. But while the interaction takes place in some sense through the shrine, the okomfos often is able to interact with the gods more widely. They talk with the gods. The gods will talk back. And so in this domain, you have what an anthropologist would call a cultural model. These are the kinds of things that people tell you about who becomes an okomfo and how you become an okomfo. And the anthropologist pulls that out and kind of organizes that into a cognitive model. So what people will say about who becomes somebody who talks to the gods is that what happens is the god will call, often out loud, maybe more than once, a couple of times. And at some point, the god will possess the human, and the human will become amnestic for a while and have a kind of fit, and other people will know that there's something going on. And that follows a period after the god has called the human in which the human doesn't want to respond. Because if you train to be this kind of a kung fu, you drop out of your training, you drop out of school, and often people are called when they're adolescents. You don't wear shoes for a couple of years. You don't have sex for a couple of years. You're dressed in a sheet for a couple of years. It's kind of, and you're kind of weird. So people are said to struggle. And they say that when you struggle, other people will say that you're crazy. You go through a period of a year, a couple of years of thinking that you're crazy. Once you agree to do this, you go for training, and there's an apprentice who takes sole control of you. And that apprentice, people will say that what you learn within this apprenticeship is a bunch of stuff about herbs, but you learn how to hear the good gods more clearly. And you learn how to disattend to the demons who are also present in this world. When somebody is training, they learn how to at least perform what you would call dissociation. They perform the god entering into the body and taking control over them. It is said that when somebody finishes their training, they will love the gods, although this is not always true. And they say that if you refuse the call, you will go mad. So in some months that I've spent in Ghana, I've spent some time in psychiatric settings, and I can say that I've met 3 people, clearly with flagrant psychosis, who have said, or their spouse has said, this is somebody who is called by the gods and refused the call. In this social world, okomfo have a kind of weird status. People will say that they're dirty. Christians say that they are trafficking with demons. Christians often use their services when they feel a need. So the point here is that okomfo clearly, actively talk about invisible beings with whom they speak and who speak in auditory voices. And you can ask, do the okomfo have a kind of madness that's managed through spiritual practice? Well, the question of whether the people we call people with schizophrenia are shamans in their world has a long and honored tradition in anthropology. Back when anthropology was young and romantic and we were discovering cultural difference, one of the great papers argued that the term normal was culturally relative, that what was normal was defined only by a local group and there was nothing stable in it. And in this famous paper by Ruth Benedict, she argues, it doesn't matter what kind of abnormality we choose for illustration. There are well-described cultures in which those abnormals function at ease and with honor and apparently without danger or difficulty in the society. And so this was taken as an argument for years around the claim that the people that we identify with psychosis or schizophrenia and who drop out of life and become dysfunctional, they would become a shaman elsewhere. And at the time, there was some pushback. George Devereux is famous for having argued that the shaman is mentally deranged. But throughout the 60s and the 70s, I would say that there was this broad shared opinion, often within psychiatry, that there was something that was going on in our Western American British society, that certain kinds of people, something in the way that we interacted with them, we turned them into the people who had schizophrenia, and they didn't need to be that way. And then, of course, psychiatry changed. So anthropology played a small role in this change. There was a famous paper by Jane Murphy in Science, and she said, in 1976, and she said, you look around the world, and everywhere you find people with disordered thoughts, thoughts that seem so weird as to be disconnected from reality, and disordered perceptions that seem so weird as to just be like nothing we do here. And she said, if you look at what shamans do, the shamans might pretend to be crazy. But in fact, there's this category of person that appears everywhere that all societies recognize as being ill. And of course, the big shift within psychiatry was this shift towards the biomedical model in 1980, represented by the publication in 1980 by the DSM-3. And in that vision, schizophrenia became kind of a poster child for brain disorder. Nancy Andreasen famously called it people with schizophrenia, people with a broken brain. And schizophrenia became a kind of thing in the world, something that was good, that went wrong with the brain. And so you would remake that question into the question of whether okomfos have a schizophrenia-like condition that might be managed by spiritual practice. Psychiatry has changed again. There are a lot of shifting currents. People are beginning to ask whether there are sharp lines between schizophrenia and other psychiatric conditions. It's clear in many waves of research that people who fall ill with something like psychosis in this culture, you look at 10 points or 10, the studies vary, but up to 10 places in the West. Compare those to up to 3 places in India. And you look at people 2 years after they fall ill, and they've got look a lot better in India. 50% better on 3 outcome measures. And so it suggests there's something social at play. Many people have begun to pay attention to early psychosis and have begun to claim, observe, that the way something people who, when they first fall ill, that this may shape the degree of their illness 20 years on. And people have begun to talk about a psychotic continuum. The idea that psychosis isn't a thing over there, but sort of a human feature that's kind of distributed throughout culture. And there's some social conditions that may, and other conditions, and the brain is complicated. And there's some reasons why some people are identified as ill. So what I want to do is step back a little bit and talk more broadly about voices, which I think are a fascinating window into the nature of human consciousness. I want to remind you something about the diversity of the voice hearing experience. Voices matter in human culture because they're evidence of spirit. So Enkidu spoke to Gilgamesh, Yahweh spoke to Abraham and to Moses, Jesus spoke to his disciples after he's left, Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. The voice is at the heart of many religions because the communication from God is the evidence that God is there. And representations of hallucinations, the vision and the voice of Mary, you find throughout Christian art. Voices have mattered in history. If Augustine had not heard a voice when he threw himself at the foot of his fig tree, the history of Christianity would be different. If Joan of Arc had not heard voices, perhaps the Kingdom of France would not have remained as it was. And on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycotts, Martin Luther King Jr. had found there were death threats against his family. He wasn't sure to go forward, whether he should go forward. He sat at his kitchen table and he prayed, and Jesus said that he would be with him. He heard Jesus say, and he went forward. Voices matter to ordinary humans. So this is what I do. This is the bread and butter of what I do. So I want to share one snippet of an interview with a charismatic Christian who seeks to have an intimate back and forth relationship with God. And she said, she was describing this to me. She said, it was pretty early on in my relationship with him. I just had wonderful devotions and worships. I felt so close. I went out and it was the most god-awful day. It was icy rain and gray and cold and it was sleeting. But then he just graced me the rest of the morning. The bus showed up right away, which it never does. I was reading and I missed my stop to get off, and I heard God say, audibly, "Get off the bus." I looked up and hollered, and the bus actually stopped. Just felt that intimacy all morning, like when you go from holding a new boyfriend's hand to kissing him goodnight. So how common are these events? So if you show up with a clipboard, you'll get a rate of about 5 to 10%. And we've found this a number of times. When I talk to people systematically, talk to charismatic Christians who seek an intimate back and forth relationship with God, you get a rate of about 30%. We've had some moment when God has spoken in a way that feels like it has a sensory, auditory quality. We know from many papers at this point that when a spouse dies, somewhere between 70 and 90% of those who have lost a spouse will say that they have felt the presence of, seen, or heard the spouse in the months after their death. So these events are not uncommon. They don't happen to everyone, and you can ask why. So there are two dominant explanations for why these events might happen. One is that God is speaking. I'm not discounting that, but I don't think that's above my pay grade, and I'm not going to explore it here. The other natural explanation is that there's a madness is sort of distributed. There's something like a psychotic continuum, which I actually believe in. There is sort of a distribution of something like psychotic process. Some people have more of it than others. But I wanted to raise the question of whether there's another explanation as well, whether there's something in the differences in the way people relate to their own thought that shapes their experience. So let me tell you a little bit about me. I think of myself as an anthropologist that studies invisible others and the way people relate to invisible others. So I wrote a book about the way that people relate to their sort of fictional Greek gods and the way that they try to revive an ancient Zoroastrian religion. I did extensive research with these evangelical Christians who seek an intimate back and forth dialogic relationship with God, and have studied similar worlds in Chennai in South India and Accra in West Africa. And I've talked to people in a variety of different faiths and practices in California and elsewhere. I've also spent thousands of hours of people that you would recognize as having psychosis. So I spent a ton of time on the streets of Chicago, in the densest area for persons with psychosis in the entire state of Illinois outside of the jails. And I've spent time in hospitals in similar settings in Chennai and in Accra. So I've come to these questions with a long experience with people who meet criteria for schizophrenia, and also with people in religious settings who say that God has spoken to them. So what I want to do now is say a little bit about what I've learned and then go back to Ghana. So what have I learned about the experiences of the voices of madness and the voices of spirit? Well, the blunt thing that I've seen is that there are two broad patterns of experience. So there are the folks with psychosis who you know well, who when they hear voices, often hear voices frequently. They can live within a beehive of sound, where they can hear sentences and paragraphs and conversations, and often the content feels pretty negative to them. The Christians who don't have psychosis, I've given them skids, but you would not think that they had psychosis. What they report is rare, 1 or 2 events. What they report is brief, 4 to 6 words, and often what they report is positive. So people will say, for example, that they've been driving down their street and God spoke up from the back seat in the car and said audibly, "I will always be with you." And they're powerful, they're startled, they're stunned. But it's wonderful that this experience has happened to them. What I've also been able to show in my work is that these rare, brief, non-negative voices, they're associated with prayer, or what you would call mental imagery cultivation practice. When my Christians are praying, they're shutting their eyes, they're spending 5 minutes to an hour in which they are in their mind's eye, walking with God, sitting in God's lap, standing in the throne room, having some series of interactions that they're trying to use their imagination to represent as vividly as they can. And the more time you pray, the more likely you are to say that's God, you've had a voice or a vision or some kind of unusual sensory experience. It's also true that the more higher somebody scores on a measure of absorption, the more likely they are to report these experiences. So here's a bit of the absorption scale, 34 items. You say true or false for me. And these different items really capture, people argue about exactly what the scale picks up, but it seems to pick up whether somebody enjoys being caught up in their inner world, whether they enjoy allowing their inner world to be vivid and compelling to them. And the questions are invitational and pleasing. Some people like the idea that they can get caught up in the world in this way. Okay, so this is something that my work has identified. Both prayer practice and the absorption scale predict, in the language of your disciplines, whether somebody says that they have vivid interactions with God, whether they have vivid inner sensory experience, whether they say their inner world is vividly alive to them, whether they have voices, visions, and other unusual sensory experiences, and whether they have the whole range of stuff that William James described as the powerful kinds of spiritual experience that people report. So what I want to raise is the possibility that there is a pathway to these experiences which is somehow different from psychotic process. That sensory attention to inner mental events, some way of paying attention to your mind, can lead to those events feeling as if they're more external, more in the world real, and may generate more judgments that an inner event is not me or perceptual rather than thought-like. I want to say that there's genuine uncertainty. I had genuine uncertainty about what to make of these frequent voice hearers like Joan of Arc. She clearly had a series of auditory experiences, 3 voices. She localized them. She looked at them. They were clearly positive. She was clearly not dysfunctional. There are many Joans. So the question of how to make sense of the Joans is at the heart of this totally cool organization called the International Consortium of Hallucination Researchers. And we are trying to find as many Joans as we can to try to figure out what's going on. And so there, Phil Corlett's group in Yale and the Durham Hearing the Voice group and the King's College London group with Quentin Dealey and Emmanuel Peters. So I'm part of some of these groups. Mediums are Joans in many ways. They talk to dead people a lot. I'm doing a project with a postdoctoral fellow, Michael Lifshitz. We're talking to people who create tulpas, who are imaginary friends. And they spend a lot of time, a lot of effort making invisible beings who talk back to them. I want to bring to your attention a claim. People have different views about this claim. But this is another claim about the voice hearing experience. And Eleanor Longden is most associated with this claim, that and she would say all voice hearing is really associated with trauma. It's dissociative in nature rather than psychotic. And of course, that's powerful and important because in the literature, we think of psychosis and schizophrenia as having in general, although, having a poor prognosis, and dissociative disorders as having a much better prognosis. So these are what I take to be the puzzles of thinking about psychosis and voices more broadly. Is there one pathway or many? I am an advocate of a many pathway understanding of these voice hearing experiences. What is the impact of practice, and how much can practice change experience? And what is the impact of culture or interpretation? the way people identify and give meaning to the voice. So now we're going to go back to Ghana. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a project that I ran in Ghana, the Mind and Spirit Project. It's a large Templeton-funded project. We worked in 5 countries. This is the Ghana team with Nana Peterson, Kara Weissman, John Doolin, and Vivian Sokoto. And John and Vivian were our lead interviewers in Ghana. And Nana and Kara and I went out for close to a month. As part of a larger project that I'm not going to explain, or I don't want to waste minutes explaining, John and Vivian interviewed 40 people, 80 people, 40 okomfos, 40 Christians, rural and urban. And in the course of a long interview about spiritual experience, we asked, have you ever heard God or the gods speak in a way you could hear with your ears? And if they said yes, we had a lot of follow-up questions. Did you ever turn your head to see who was speaking? Were you falling asleep? Did you hear it? Did you feel it was in your mind or outside or here? So we had a lot of conversation about this. By the time I showed up, they had identified 18 people who said that they had heard voices once a week or more often. And so remember, they've already been interviewed for about 2 hours, and we actually knew a ton about them. And so then I show up, and what I did is I played for them a track took 45 seconds out of a track that Pat Deegan made. And so Pat Deegan, psychologist, meets criteria for schizophrenia. She made this track to represent the experience of hearing voices. And I should say that when we played it, we typically translated it into Fonte for people. So I'm just going to play it for you. And here we go. So you can hear what it sounds like. And the point is to recognize the diversity of experiences.
You are the one. I came for you. I came for you because you are the one. It's you. You are the one I came for. You
Stop
are the one. It's you. It's you I came for. It's you. It's you.
Look at
and
their
you have
eyes.
the way.
Look at them.
I
Their
came
eyes
for
are full
you.
of disgust.
You have the way.
You smell.
know you have
You are
the way.
disgusting.
We know you.
They're looking at you and seeing you, and they see everything you do, and you are disgusting. 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 Hey, stop it. Stop it now. Don't touch that. Don't touch it.
So what I would do is I'd show up with a Fonte speaker, and because English is a language of instruction in Ghana, many people were able to speak in English, but some of them spoke in Fonte. And we would talk for about an hour about their experience of the gods. And then at the end, I would play that track, and I would say, is this what you hear when you talk to the gods? So I thought I saw 4 patterns. My numbers are small. I wouldn't say that there are bright, clear lines between these groups, but let me tell you, but I think there's something real here. And I'm making, so there was group 1, and group 1, there were people who would say, that track is exactly what they sound like. So, not such a pleasant track. The gods sound exactly like that. And they seemed, in the interview, they talked about active audible voices and active audible negative voices, which they talked about managing rather than having control over. When they told the story of how they felt, how they became an okomfos, everybody had to go through that period when people thought they were crazy. Well, some people tell that story with 3-part harmony. They tell that story with a lot of richness, and I listening to it 10 years later, think that other people thought they were pretty odd, and other people tell a story and it's not very persuasive. I thought that this group had more people, their stories were better stories. There was another group. I asked everybody about trauma and sexual trauma. And another group, there were 3 people who really foregrounded the story of violence and trauma, which doesn't mean other people did not experience trauma. But it was very striking, the role of violence in their stories. I thought when they told the story of that period when they were struggling, I found it less persuasive. There was a group of people who seemed to me to just love the gods. They either rejected the track, or in one case, which I'll actually show to you, she liked the track, but then when she's talking about I wasn't persuaded that she was having active auditory experiences. These were people who seemed to love being caught up with the gods. And then there were a bunch of people who didn't have auditory experiences in quite the same way. They seemed to have experiences during sleep or when they woke up. The experiences were more in their minds. Let me give you just a feel of what I'm talking about. So here's Mary. And all these people are doing fine. None of them are hospitalized. Mary is an effective okomfo. She has clearly auditory events even now. The gods sound like snakes. She was very clear that you had to be careful when you were in the wilderness, because you might think you were hearing a god, but it was really a snake. She hears lots of demons. She was odd during the interview. She seemed to be hearing voices as we were talking. George was a little bit of a puzzle to me. His face was very, very mobile, very alive. He wasn't odd in the way that Mary was odd. Very clear that he had auditory experiences. Interviewed him 4 times about this. I've interviewed him on Skype about this. He kept saying, well, I learned how not to pay attention to the demons. I still hear demons, but I've learned not to pay attention. His story about that moment of refusal, very vivid. And his aunt tried to hospitalize him. So Bill says that he's having these experiences, but as he's talking about the demons, it becomes clear that he's talking at least in part about moral temptation rather than voices. His story, it was full of violence. It was a story of rape. Rape led to these shushing sounds. He learns how to pray. He has a manual which he teaches him how to pray. He's a very ardent prayer, and the shushing sounds have gone away. Here's our candidate. The candidate really liked the track, but I thought, and so this is my judgment, my subjective judgment, as we were talking, I thought that this was something, she just thought it was sort of entertaining. As she talked about her voices, it sounded like a really fun trance. It sounded like a daydream. She liked to enter the daydream. She was, and she, there wasn't a lot of sensory richness in the way that she talked about her experience. Lily listened to this track and said, oh my God, I've never heard anything like that. This is insane. So many people in Ghana particularly Christians, will treat the middle of the night as the most dangerous period. That's when the demons are close, and it is as a religious responsibility, a religious honor to pray against the demons in the middle of the night. And that's when she heard God speak. She would find that, and it was periodically audible, but it was on the edges of sleep and awareness. So I think there is, so this would be my hypothesis. We're trying to do more work on this to try to feel more. So the Yale group and the Durham group and the KCL group and us, we're trying to think about how we would think more clearly about how to differentiate subgroups within the worlds of Joan of Arc's. But I think that it's worth, I want to suggest that there's a hypothesis that there's some people who have something like a psychotic process. Some people have something more like a trauma dissociation process. Some people who are just trance lovers, who are who are enjoying the experience of having these imaginary friends. And others who are sort of, I would put in the domain of sleep or aspirational, sleep experiencers or aspirational hearers. So the answer I want to give is that the shaman or okomfo is psychotic sometimes. But practice may mitigate the psychosis. And the operative word here, of course, is may, because I haven't demonstrated that. But I think it's worth paying attention to what the okomfo is learning. So it's an intense and unpleasant apprenticeship. You've got to be motivated. When they work with the gods, they learn to know the gods, what people say. They learn how to know the gods. They learn to hear their voices more clearly. And they learn to distinguish between the good and evil voices. So there's something like these practices of knowing, naming, interacting, ignoring. They're learning to attend to the more desired voice, to disattend to the more negative voices. And there's a principle of respect. Because if you're going to interact with the gods, one thing we know is that you've got to be respectful. The other thing that you could describe that as making the voices into social persons within a social world. So it's my own view that one of the things that happens is that the voice, if somebody is hearing a voice that is re-described as the voice of a god, what happens is that that voice is made into a social person and perhaps learns to behave according to the social expectations of that local world. So I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is consonant with a new approach towards hearing voices. It's a little radical because some of the folks who run these groups are a little radical, and Dr. Kalapanos is beginning to do some research on these groups. But the principles of the hearing voices groups are pretty similar to the principles that I saw in Ghana. People learn to name their voices, they learn to respect their voices, and then they learn to negotiate with their voices. They learn to experience their voices in a social relationship. I don't think this works for everybody. I think there's enough data out there to suggest that it may work for some people. I think what you see is a story of complex interactions. There's much more to learn, but that there's some kind of interaction between, well, I'll call metaphorically bodily pathways, cultural models, ideas about what these voices are, and practices that may shape these voices in different ways depending upon the bodily orientation, the process in the body, the intensity of the practice and the kind of practice, and the way that culture names the practice. I think about this as a story of cultural kindling. I think what you see in the Pat Deegan track is what you might call the affordances of the psychotic experience, of the voice-hearing psychotic experience. Good voices, bad voices, commanding voices, squishy noises, voices, soft voices, loud voices. And people, local culture alters how those affordances are identified and shapes how they're experienced. I want to share, and I think if this is working, what people hear may become habituated and fluent. I'm just going to take a few more minutes to, so I'm going to try to make this claim with a little more bite. I'm going to show you one example of a track. So this is a way, many people will describe this track as twittering birds. And so let's see if we can play this for you. So if I tell you that's actually language, and that it's the first line of the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. You hear it differently. And we know that once you hear it that way, you can't go back to hearing the twittering birds. So one of the things I did with colleagues is to talk, and I know that some of the residents have seen this, is to talk to folks who meet criteria for schizophrenia in California, San Mateo, and in Accra, and also in Cape Coast, although this is about Accra, and in Chennai. Talk to them, tried to compare them, talk to them pretty carefully about their voice hearing experience. One of the striking things that we learned is that in America, with these 20 people, Americans were much more violent. The voices were much more violent, and nobody knew who was talking. And the Americans hated their voices. In Ghana, half the sample told me that they had a dominant voice who was God, who was positive, who they really liked, and to help them deal with their problem, which is that somebody had put them in the hospital. And in Chennai, people heard kin. They heard people they knew, their mother, their father, people to whom they could give a moral location. So why do we care about this? Well, I think we know, not from my work, but from the WHO work, that Americans, Westerners, become more distressed when they're psychotic. And I think this kind of ethnographic work can invite us to think about whether voices respond to learning and might suggest new treatments and support these new treatments that are out there. Why does it matter for psychiatry? Well, I think the biomedical orientation really is to ask people to ignore their voices rather than to engage with their voices. And this may be a mistake. I don't want to suggest that it's a panacea to have people engage with their voices, but I think that it's worth considering whether teaching people to treat their voices as people and to develop a respectful relationship might be useful. I think this also teaches psychiatry that not all voice hearing is psychotic, that not all, for want of a better term, psychotic process is ill, and that spiritual practices can be fundamentally psychotherapeutic. So I'll end there. I just wanted to, this is our candidate. It's not actually a picture of our candidate, but it's what she looked like when she came in to talk to me in her interview, which I thought was kind of wonderful. So thank you very much.
Do you want to say anything? Or?
I was just going to make a few remarks.
Yeah.
You could do that.
No, go ahead, please.
So this is very interesting, actually, I think, for an audience of psychiatrists and psychologists and behavioral scientists, because I think it speaks to something that I've been interested in for a long time, which is that it all depends on where you start. So you start as an anthropologist, but I start with an interest in imagination.
Yes.
So if you think of, as has been said by more famous people than we, the interesting thing about a human being is that you can see a horse, yes, and you can see a man, and then you can turn it into a centaur.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you think about it like that, then imagination becomes something that the sane person or the insane person, if you want to create a continuum, can use to create a new experience, a new universe, yes?
Yeah.
Which you can then populate with all sorts of stories about what it is that you are actually
Absolutely
doing. So if you think about it like that, then I hear what you say at the end, which I absolutely agree with, that there is a continuum on which the individual then populates their life. But initially, these experiences, even if they're driven by, for example, the taking of a hallucinogenic drug like psilocybin, or whether they're stimulated by some sort of temporal lobe epilepsy or something else, they disturb the actual usual rational thought that the person is used to experiencing the world with. I think what you've done, which is fascinating and very interesting from the standpoint of how one pursues it further, is you've taken all that, but you've put it within a cultural context, which I think is so very important and was missed by biological psychiatry for 2 or 3 decades, actually, within our own experience. Yes. So it went from burning the witches, these poor folks, to putting them in hospitals, to then analyzing them to then, in fact, deciding that they all had some sort of mental illness that could be biologically driven, and therefore changing that base, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go back to, you know, where did human imagination begin? And I don't know when we think about that, but you as an anthropologist might agree that if you go into the caves in southern France, you know, you get these pictures of hands and you get these cracks in the wall, and all the hands are around the cracks in the wall, because somewhere in there is, you can imagine there is somebody who continues with what. So the question then is, I would see imagination as the core of a lot of this, which is a completely normal function, but it gets distorted in what we call psychosis, even though that may be a continuum. You don't have to worry about what it is that the psychosis is driven by. All you have to think about is, how does that continuum extend itself in the human experience? And I think what I got from your lecture was the notion that there is a rational understanding of that continuum if we are willing to embrace broadly culture as well as biology. And so that was my question. Would you agree with that? And if so, how can we learn from you not to dump our cultural experience, but to learn from folks like yourself in terms of enriching our understanding of imagination and when it goes wrong?
Well, so I think that, so from my point of view, there are 4 pathways, at least, that lead to unusual experiences.
Right.
There's something that I'll call, for want of a better term, psychosis, absorption/imagination, trauma connected to imagination, and sleep. And ayahuasca, and there are others. But one of the things I think you see in the shamanic world, or what I've been calling the shamanic world of the Kung Fu, is that all of these folks who seem to be able to grab hold of their experiences can dissociate. They can get caught up in their inner world. I expect that the people who do best in hearing voices groups, and the people who are able, I mean, there are plenty of folks in Ghana who are psychotic and in hospitals. Right. So I suspect that the folks who are best able to manage their, if they have a psychotic process, the folks who are best able to manage it aren't so sick to begin with, but are also able to really engage with the imagination. And
so they put a rational frame around the imagination. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so I'm not sure I would use that phrasing, but I do think that understanding absorption is super important. And I think there's a relatively little work on absorption. And so there are, 2 or 3 groups of us that are doing this work. Still a relatively new concept in studying spirituality. I think that the study of, the study of spiritual experiences, which are these more sensory expressions of some capacity, there's still much to do. I think I do, the way I would agree with you is I think that, here's a claim. I think the mind is social. There's something very powerful about the human mind in which we have others, and some people, either because they have a proclivity, they're high in absorption, they're very imaginative people, or they practice, or because their culture invites them, are able to, create those invisible others more powerfully.
Right.
In a psychotic process, often those invisible others are pretty awful. But it's also possible to create invisible others that are not so awful. And so I do think that psychiatry could learn from that process.
Right. That would be the rational process in my mind.
Okay.
But I'm being self-indulgent. There must be lots of questions out here. Yeah. So, sir. Oh, right. You've got the microphone. That makes a big difference.
Thank you very, very much for a really, really thought-provoking presentation. One symptom that we all know of schizophrenia that's very prominent and often debilitating are delusions, which are often conceptualized as kind of normal brain forming an explanatory model for these very, very distressing experiences. I wonder, in that group that you identified in Ghana as being clearly psychotic, whether the religious community kind of providing this religious explanatory model, whether that obviated the need in any sense for strong entrenched delusional symptoms.
I think that's a great question, and I think it's true. So now from one point of view, I knew a ton about these people, and other ethnographers have worked in the area before. In my interactions, they didn't produce ideas, beliefs that were wildly out of whack. I do think it's quite possible that if you step into a world like this, you don't need delusions. It is also true, and you know this perfectly well, that there are people, so somebody that I have been writing about is somebody who was helped, who heard voices. His aunt, who went to the church I've been studying, stepped into his life and offered full, rich accounts of his experience. And his interpretations became what you would call delusions. And it scared his aunt. And Gabriel showed up and told him to kill his grandmother, and he did. So that also happens. It's not a perfect story. But I do think that you're right. These systems can be, I think they can be helpful for people.
Well, there's a question over here.
Yeah. Two things. Thank you for a very interesting talk. One was, this seems to harken back to sort of ideas of a bicameral theory of mind.
Yes. I love
right?
Julian James.
Yes. That was the first comment. And the second is, I guess I heard this as somewhat of a cautionary tale in reifying this experience of hearing voices and separating it from the overall cultural context. You say that could be used in a therapeutic sense, but it also points to the potential to do more harm by separating it out. I wonder if you could just comment on that a little bit more.
You mean by separating out hearing voices as clearly pathological?
Yes,
yeah.
Separating it out from the cultural context. That can actually do more harm is what I heard you say.
That's, I don't want to be a Pollyanna. Psychosis is difficult. It's often very difficult for families to deal with. I think it may be the case that when Americans first have an odd experience, they go very quickly to the idea that they are crazy. And I think that's very costly. So I think that what I hear from the Americans who hear voices and carry diagnoses is a fear of the voices that's very, very striking. And I would say that I hear that less often in other cultural groups. And that, again, everyone that I've interviewed who is in a hospital or in a hospital setting, who hears voices and I'm there to talk to them about their voices, every one of them says, I didn't tell people about these voices because I was afraid I'd be called crazy. And I just didn't get that elsewhere. So I think that's quite striking. I do think that Julian James is right. I do not have any position about what I regard as a slightly crazed ideas about the brain. But I do think that if you have a model of the mind in which the interior is not very important, which is his claim, actually it's Bruno Snell's claim about the mind of the Iliad, people are more likely to say that they have auditory events. So that's actually, that was the structure of the big project that I did. Think of people, anyway, there's more to say about that one.
There were other hands, but they seem to have disappeared. We have time for another question. Oh, that's
2 more questions.
2 more questions, right? One here and one at the back.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, really fascinating talk. And so I work with
youth that are at clinical high risk for psychosis here in the program at UCLA. And I mean, I was very interested in, it seems like the experiences, your subgroupings of responses to those, the audio recording of voices was actually maps on very closely to what we see in terms of, you know, what I would view as clusters of folks here in the US that are very diverse, you know, cultural group of youth. And so I was curious if you feel like that's sort of culturally specific, or if you think that, you know, say other groups of voice hearers in other cultures would have a similar sorts of
Subtyping?
clustering. Yeah.
Yeah, I think these clusters are real. So I think so. I think that's what we're looking for in the groups of the mediums. In my experience, limited, but you know, sort of 20 hours of interview. Some mediums seem to have stories which invite you to think about pathology, and they have experiences where the voices are much more external. Some mediums, they just seem to love the idea that they can talk to the dead. And I thought I would find the same thing with the tulpomancers. I'm not really finding that. They have, I'm seeing more differences in capacities to imagine. But I feel pretty confident that in this talk about, in the groups of the Joans of Arcs, there are different kinds of processes at play.
Is about the absorption scale. Do you, I mean, I have actually a lot of questions about it, but have you studied it in any other groups? And does it seem to be culturally specific in any way? So do different cultures generally rate higher, or is their average score different?
So I know the answer is yes. We are very excited to, I believe, be the first group to report that, or to use the absorption scale across cultural. You know, we used it. We just in this big study, we used it in Chinese. We used it in Thai. We used it in Bislama. I don't think we've looked at it in Fante. We used it in, but we looked at it in China, Ghana, Vanuatu, Thailand, in addition to the US. And we've done a little work in Amazonia. And it robustly predicts cool, weird stuff everywhere. So it robustly predicts voices and visions and spiritual experience, and the vividness of the relationship with God. And that's quite striking. Is it different in different? So we did a lot of work with the scale. So there, so the field workers really sat around the table and not only did translation and back translation, not around the table, but there were items like I can be something like I can. I'm going to get the item a little bit wrong, but my imagination is stimulated by the crackle of a wood fire. So that works really well in the States. Doesn't work so well in it doesn't work so well in Chennai. And so what I am more stunned, so we tried to slightly alter items so that they would work across. But what I am more stunned by is the fact that it worked, that the people who answered yes to the absorption scale answered yes in other ways. We found that it was associated with whether people said they had a lot of inner thought. It was associated, we asked in umpteen different ways about spiritual awareness, spiritual experience. Means do get a little depressed, or they're a little, if I'm remembering correctly, they're a little higher in Vanuatu and they're a little lower in Ghana. They're not, but they're sort of within a kind of a bandwidth of about 2 points. In the States, there's a sort of roughly a 1 point difference between male and female undergraduates. Women score a little bit more highly. So it's an utterly fascinating scale, and there's much to learn from it.
Thank you very much for broadening our horizons. Thank you.
Thank you so much.